Okay, we are live Christmas today in July, actually August, but whatever, October, whatever. We never talk about Christmas when it's actually like Christmas.
Time is immaterial.
Anyway, I'll just briefly give my thoughts because I got nothing from this episode. I was so bored. I watched it. I was so bored. I had no notes. I was like, what am I going to say about this episode besides I didn't like it? The end.
I was going to say it took me a minute. When you mentioned the episode title, I was like, right, that was the episode. The one with the guy who's not the doctor.
I just call him the mayor because he would have part on The Walking Dead.
Yeah, okay, I thought I recognized him. Well, like, I didn't hate this episode. It wasn't exactly not entertaining either. It was a candy episode for me, I think. He's a very good actor, the guy that they got to play the next Doctor. Even though they gave him a lot of material to work with, the little bits of character writing that they did for him and Tennant together especially, and Rosita, I thought were really well crafted given the amount of space they had to work with. I hated the Cyberman dog thing so bad. Oh my god, it was like a Power Rangers villain. And the Cyber King, also really weird, but the human villain was pretty good. Pretty bog standard motivation. It was very one-dimensional, but like she sold it, at least in my opinion, through the acting. A lot of this hinged on the specific cast. If it was really bad actors doing this material, I would have just fell asleep halfway through the episode if I'd even survived that long.
Like me.
Exactly.
But like in fairness, you let me know in advance that like you might forget things, and so I took notes for both of us. I find this episode kind of a blank, and like the way that Brianna described it was just flat, and like we spent a while trying to work out like what is it that makes it so like middle of the road for both of us. It's harmless, there's nothing really wrong with it all that much. It's just kind of, it's boring. Part of that problem is actually the villain for me. She's acted fine and she's got like the evil kind of charisma that you'd expect. I don't like whenever we do like Cybermen working for like a human person, but here they were manipulating her until they are. It's really weird. What I think is weird is that her whole thing is that like she's against chauvinism and like misogyny, and she's really like trying to take down man's world.
Also, if that came out today, could you imagine?
I don't want to imagine. Don't make me think about that hypothetical.
Remember that Doctor Who did not used to be political before Chris Chibnall.
It only pushed the woman agenda when Jodie showed up. It never had any like feminist ideas before that.
I just think it's weird because outside of when she brings it up, this episode is not about those things.
It's like an informed motivation almost for her.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have Rosita, who's like Lake's companion, but it's really weird because I don't understand what that's doing in a Cyberman story in particular. Like, I tried to think about it, like, is there an idea here? Is there like a thematic reason I could think of why you would make like sexism a theme in a story about the Cybermen? And I just don't think it gels.
I think the only reason they did it was because of the time period and they wanted a female villain, and that's literally it.
But like Lucy, if it was just a matter of it's the time period, then I could see giving her a couple of lines. It comes up in almost every scene. This is how far we go with it. We imply, like to the extent that we can imply in this show, that she is a rape victim. And like she has this line where she's like, another man come to like assert himself against me in the night. And it's like, what are we doing? What are we saying with this character? Because I don't think we have like a fully formed idea here.
I think what makes it worse is that if it is meant to be bringing up the idea of sexism and chauvinism in that time period, it's not an entirely sympathetic or portrayal to those issues, because she is not remotely remorseful for anything she does. She has no nuance whatsoever. She's a really flat, one-note villain, and her backstory does not make her remotely sympathetic. So it's a bit off.
And like what really seals it is that she also just goes straight to using child labor. That's the big thing. Is like, yes, you're right. The time period has a real sexism problem. You know what else it has? A child labor problem, and you're just doing it again.
See, sexism creates child labor.
Weird, yeah, because her whole thing seems to be against like the institution that kept her in this role and kept her subjugated. So she decided to subjugate people more vulnerable. If it's trying to say something, which I don't think it is, it's not saying that very well or very thoughtfully. It's a recurring theme with some of Davy's stories. I don't think this is intentional. He just didn't really care what the implications of his writing.
Didn't he also like win the day by like forcing her to feel empathy too?
Supposed to be like a parallel, because with Jackson Lake, the guy who's the fake doctor, we make this point about how like he was in a fugue state. He watched his wife get killed, he watched his son get kidnapped, and it like made him just mentally retreat. Like he couldn't deal with it. And that's why his mind was basically a blank slate to have the doctor's identity like put onto it. And we'll get into that and like the handling of that later. But I'm like, is that also supposed to be what happened with Miss Cardigan? She got raped and then she went in a fugue state where like all she can feel is like anger and hatred, and then the doctor like somehow unlocks. Yeah, no,
I think you're thinking about this more than the writers did, man.
But it's there. Like it's not there to the extent that I think the writers realized it, but we have one character who like suffered a huge trauma and their brain basically shut down. And then we have another character who suffered this huge trauma, and the solution to like getting her to be a human again is to like unlock part of her brain. And I'm like, I don't think you realize what you're doing. If what I'm saying isn't true, which I think you guys are right, and I'm giving it too much credit to even suggest that, then what we have is just she was this very angry like person who just hated men, and then the doctor like reset her brain,
did something to her body against her will, but it was okay this time because he's the good guy.
Oh god!
I mean, the doctor does reverse what the Cyberman did, who did force her to become the Avatar, or whatever.
The Cybermen turn her into the Cyber King, basically to get rid of all her emotions, and the doctor makes her realize what has happened and sort of switches her back to humanity.
The problem with what you're suggesting, Rob, is that we do the Craig thing here. This is the first time we have overwhelming the Cyberman programming just because you're so emotional. The message is like love over everything. Here, she's just so mad and so angry that like they put her in the cyber controller chair and she's just like, nope, I'm still me. I'm going to use this giant robot to do what I want. So that's why the doctor, like, opening up her mind again, it doesn't work. It's like, look what you've become. They've turned you into, like, less than human. No, she's been in control this whole time.
Yeah, also, side note, I don't mind so much emotions like overwriting the Cyberman, just because I think if anything's going to overwrite their programming, that would be it.
I don't agree, but it's not a huge element in this episode for me. We'll talk about it during closing time.
I actually want to talk about the emotion thing because it did take me out of this episode.
It really is a product of literally that time and place. They announced David Tennant was leaving after the 2009 specials. The idea that this is going to be the next Doctor, it's a huge tease to the idea that they're going to introduce the Doctor before Tennant even regenerates. And it just seems to be building up on this idea that they're just going to introduce the new Doctor in between these specials. And that's where the main tension is, whether or not this guy is actually the Doctor or not. And it's one of those things where they had this base idea, and then they were going to throw the Cyberman in, because why not? And then, because they knew they weren't going to regenerate David Tennant in this Dave Morrissey is not going to be the new Doctor. They didn't have much else to grasp the episode on to make it even remotely compelling or interesting or engaging at all. I will say that they don't try to drag this out too long. I think it's like halfway through the episode, they reveal he's not the Doctor, and then they just move on with the story, which is better than just dragging it on until like the very end, which would have been incredibly tedious.
It's obvious from the start of the episode that he isn't actually the Doctor. He uses a wooden screwdriver, tarnishes a balloon, and he doesn't remember David Tennant's Doctor. It's like, I remember watching it as a kid, being so excited for the episode. I was like, I bought into the whole marketing campaign. When you watch the episode, it's literally, I remember just being so underwhelmed by it, just like, oh, he's obviously not the Doctor. Okay, so what else do we have here?
It honestly just feels like they had the idea in terms of a marketing gimmick, and they were just like to Russell T Davies, write it like this because that will really sell the Christmas special. And he had no other ideas beyond that because he just was not engaged with this base concept. And it is really silly. And the one thing I really hate is that you can tell the direction is not that great for this episode because there's a lot of info dumping, but you're not really engaged with any of the information. Like, I have half an idea of what the kind of gobbledygook is involving how he thinks he's a Doctor, how the stuff with the Cyberman works, the baseline Cyberman thing made of whatever, but they don't really establish anything. Like, they have the glow stick that is supposed to have memory and do absolutely everything. They're used to bring people's memories back. They're used to bring down the Cyberman. It's so silly. They're just there to get the plot forward. Like, they're just a non-sonic screwdriver way of getting the plot forward and to explain the memory thing. I don't think it's so much the writing, because I do think things are explained kind of. It's that the direction is so dull and it's so expository. You don't really connect with what the hell is actually being said. And I also don't think they really explain why he thinks he's the Doctor.
I'm actually going to advocate for this because I don't think the info stamps are that bad. Like, they do the two things. Like, they hold the information and they, like, overload the Cybermen just with the information. Like, the idea is they need these things in the first place because their regular Cyberman brains just can't process all that. So if you overload them with it, then they explode. I just kept thinking about, like, Diamanda Hawkins' thing when she reviewed this episode. The man who never would shoot you would totally shoot you if you were made of metal and your head would explode. So, like, what happens with Lake is, like, he gets traumatized, so he goes into a fugue state. And so his brain is like empty. And so the info stamp paves over that with information about the doctor. And like, I think, just to speak to what you were talking about and like the actual content of the episode versus the marketing gimmick, on the one hand, it's not as bad as you're saying, but on the other hand, it's worse than you're saying.
My complaint was more the fact that it was a very in-the-moment thing, because you know he's not the Doctor anymore, because Matt Smith's the Doctor. This episode doesn't have a lot of rewatchable value in comparison to when it was first airing. And as Rob said, they don't really try to hide the fact that he isn't the Doctor.
It's the same as the Doctor's daughter when they marketed that whole episode on, oh my god, the Doctor's daughter is in this episode, and they had a trailer with Jenny saying, hello, Dad. And then in literally the first minute of the episode, it's basically like, oh, it's just actually a clone from the Doctor's DNA. And she says, hello, Dad. They basically shoehorn it into the script so they could make a trailer line. And it's the same with the title of this episode as well. They don't have a script moment like that, luckily, which sounds like a soundbite to put in a trailer. So I'll give it a bit of credit for that. Ooh.
It's odd that they constructed it that way, too, because as Nick was saying, the advertising for the episode tries to make it seem like this could be number 11. But then you go into the episode, and the mystery is more about who the person is, and you know they're not the Doctor, because there's something off about them, but it doesn't quite explain to you that they are like a human being. You just notice all these little oddities, like why are they acting like this when it's clear that they're not a regeneration? And that's, I think, the mystery for the first half, rather than is he the next Doctor?
The period of time where we like pretend even for a minute that he might actually be a future regeneration lasts maybe 5 to 10 minutes of screen time. My first thing was like, he should have known it wasn't the future version of him, because he goes in for a hug, and they are never that affectionate with themselves. What I think is maybe like kind of a weird bit of the construction, because like what we're talking about right now on its own doesn't have to be a problem. Like if the episode isn't in line with the way it's marketed, and the question is like, okay, this guy is clearly not the Doctor, what is his deal? That on its own is a fine premise for an episode, but we do kind of weird things with it where we're like, what's his TARDIS? His TARDIS is a big hot air balloon, and like, isn't that surprising? We don't find that out until like 2/3 of the way into the episode. We already know for sure that he's not the Doctor before we get there. And the way that you know for sure is because we do the whole bit with the watch. If there was ever a single moment that is 100% guarantees that this is not the Doctor, it's, oh, he just has this watch, and we make a big deal out of what if it's a chameleon arch again. And no, it just opens and it's a watch.
That was actually a legitimately really funny moment, too.
One person I saw reviewing this made a point, and I've not listened to the audio myself, but this episode's sort of loosely based off a Big Finish audio called The One Doctor. Well, I've not listened to it yet, but it sounds a hell of a lot more interesting than this. I mean, the whole premise is it's kind of the same as this, another person claiming to be the Doctor, and he thinks it's a future incarnation. It turns out this is someone who's impersonating the Doctor for their own profit, basically. It's that I've not listened to it yet, but I think it was a Sylvester McCoy audio. And those are usually very good.
Just going back to what I said about the exposition, it's not so much that the things don't make sense. They are explained. It's just that it's so flatly handled that I don't really engage with what's happening. It's not interesting. It's not a cool new way of looking at the Cyberman. And that's the one thing cool about the Cyberman, their original basis. It's more like seeing the cool ways they use their tech in different scenarios, like the Cybermats and stuff like that, seeing the way they program themselves in advance. But the Cyber Shades, interesting idea, really lame presentation. Apparently when they downgrade the Cyberman's tech, they don't always come up with interesting ideas. And the Cyber King thing is dumb and over the top and just kind of comes out of nowhere because they want a big climax for the Christmas special.
I do love that the Cyber King, such a big plot hole. Such a huge plot hole that the next showrunner literally resets time to get rid of it.
This next season, we're going to get into like the Matt Smith era, and the first big arc there is the cracks in time of like the TARDIS explodes and it creates these cracks in the skin of just everything. So everywhere at some point there's a crack that'll just take something and erase it from existence.
Yeah.
That works perfectly well, and we'll get into it when we talk about that season as like its own self-contained narrative arc for Series 5. But you just know that the impetus for doing it in the first place is because at this point we've gotten to a place of like giant Cybermen just stamping around
Victorian London.
in Victorian London.
Usually, Russell T Davies would have like alien invasions in the past a lot more low key. And he'd usually, I think, if it was big enough, he'd come up with a reason why people didn't remember it. This time he didn't bother. It's just, oh yeah, giant Cybermen stamping around Victorian London. Nobody remembers it at all. Moffat had actually the same problem when he did the dinosaur thing in Deep Breath. No one remembers that somehow. It used to be always. I think the people of Victorian London must have really bad memories. There wasn't many history books around.
They don't
at the
write
time.
things down.
They still have the bad memory even today.
See, what bothered me about the Cyber King wasn't that. It was the fact that apparently their Dreadnought class ships were not allowed to be piloted by a member of their own species. And yet these were used in the Time War, apparently. So did they just, like, steal aliens from other races and just, like, throw them in the chairs? Or, like, what happened there?
I don't think Russell Davies has a great grasp of the Cybermen. They're a monster that has rarely ever been effectively used past their first appearance. Their whole point, survival. That's terrifying. That's a great premise. But because the show veers towards family, kids-ish, it's really difficult to mull a lot of stories out of them. And I won't go into the full history of them because we're talking about 50 years of stories, so I won't bother. But one of the things I've always thought that was interesting is that somebody said it's very rare, especially in the new series, we haven't really got a Cyberman story. We've had good stories with Cybermen in them.
If you isolate World Enough and Time on its own, separate it from the Doctor Falls, it is a brilliant Cyberman origin story, also based off a Big Finish audio.
In terms of Cyberman, they dropped the ball in the Doctor Falls, but World Enough of Time is a great Cyberman story. Something like The Invasion, which is Patrick Trump's story, is a good story with the Cyberman as villains. It's not a good Cyberman story. So they're difficult enough for any writer to get, but Russell T Davies, the 2 times he wrote them, the Cybermen are really lame in both stories. I don't like them in the series 2 finale. I know that's a controversial opinion.
Hey, I was actually going to defend them, saying that they were okay in the series 2 part, even though I'm not too fond of that story overall. But I feel like in that story he did get them. It's just the series 2 finale and this episode, he wrote them as just so pathetic and just like in Doomsday, they basically just get creamed by the Daleks in the most one-sided war in history.
He tries to use this due to the fact that they were thrown out of time and they don't have access to their tech. And I'm aware that it's a different context and we're not. Chibnall's era is not hugely popular amongst us crowd, but I think with the use of the lone Cyberman in the first story, not in the 2-parter, and he's just one Cyberman traveling back in time, he's terrifying. This can be used effectively, but I don't think Davies was that interested in really anything in the story. The script just feels very half-hearted. The only things I will compliment it on are that David Morrissey is trying. I think his character is really flat, and the reveal is a bit too telegraphed for me. He is putting a lot of effort and charisma into trying to pretend to be this facility of the Doctor. I think the rest of the characters are really boring. I compliment Davies a lot on his character writing. I just don't think it was very effective here. And a dumb thing, which doesn't have anything to do with the story, this is the first time we get confirmation on screen that Paul McGann is confirmed as the 8th Doctor.
Human Nature appears in John Smith's book. That was the first time.
Here it's actually Paul McGann's face.
No, he's right. It's Human Nature because officially 8th Doctor, but they never mentioned it really in the show until that moment because obviously Eccleston regenerated off screen.
Russell T Davies used to write a sitcom called Queer as Folk, and in that one, 2 of the characters argue about whether Paul McGann is a canon Doctor.
Before we get too far away from Dan's point about the Cybermen, I do want to continue on that. The conversation again that Brianna and I had watching this episode, I was thinking of the same tweet that you might be thinking by Mr. TARDIS, where he's like, great Cybermen stories have yet to be made, maybe.
The Tomb of the Cybermen is the one great Cyberman central story, but Cybermen aren't at the best in that. I think the best when the Mondas Cybermen.
Because the reason we got into it is that Brianna, you actively dislike the Cybermen. They will distract from an episode for you whenever they show up. And I think that's because just too often they're handicapped by the fact that, like Dan said, this is a family show and their premise is inherently kind of horrifying in a way this show is not always equipped to take advantage of. So too often they show up and they might as well just be robots. And they're not robots. That's what makes them interesting, and we just don't know how to treat them any differently. This doesn't have to be a Cybermen story. This could be anything. This could be any random alien.
That's kind of my point. Their entire motivation is just to build a giant robot.
Cybermen started off with such a grounded concept, and they eventually just took it way too over the top in the revived series to the point where it was just ridiculous, and then it just became less compelling and eventually a joke.
They focus way more on the whole technological advance thing rather than the guys are people trying to survive and remove their emotions in order to survive premise of it, because as you said, and this is like back in the time like William Hartnell, early-ish Patrick Troughton, where they went in this surprisingly dark and violent place for the threshold that they could reach. So when they introduced them there, it was a little easier to get away with stuff like this because they were trying new things. It was Hartnell's last story as well, so they wanted to kind of bring up a massive threat. Basically, they were losing the Daleks, which were the most popular character. They are the only reason Doctor Who is still around. And they needed a monster to replace them with, so they just picked the Cybermen because of the fact that they're really difficult to bring back and not have that over and over and over again like the Daleks, because they have such a terrifying premise. They diluted them, and they've just been kind of not inherently greatly used since because, like I said, they're a difficult monster to use. This is a video in of itself, not in a review of this, because it goes into a lot of the lore and stuff, but my main point being they suck here.
The closing time, I think, for the worst Cybermen in the show's history, I think.
Not a bad episode, it's just they should not use the Cyberman for an episode like that.
The episode's not bad, it's just the usage of the
Or
Cybermen.
also, Stephen Moffat wants to use the Cyberman in the 12th episode of every single one of his series for some reason, and he has done it in every single one of his series for some reason.
Just to summarize, Russell T Davies, I personally think he never puts any effort into his Christmas specials. It comes across like he's writing it just because Doctor Who has the Christmas slot on Christmas Day. But this one really just took the mick. I mean, he basically just decided, let's have it in Victorian London, let's have the Cybermen in there. Explanation for why the Cybermen are there is lazy. It's as lazy as Victory of the Daleks with one ship survived the giant explosion. Also, they somehow stole technology from the Daleks, and that's why they're in Victorian London. That's the explanation. It's just stupid. The Cyber Shades are bad. Villain, bad. One-dimensional. David Morrissey's character, fantastic actor, David Morrissey. One of the Britain's best actors, I think. But he's completely wasted, and his character sucks. Corny, predictable. Bait and Switch is awful. They don't even bother putting any effort into trying to hide it. Plot too long at 1 hour. Russell T Davies, I think, always struggled with fitting enough plot the hour-long slot on Christmas Day. It's clear he just wasn't putting the amount of effort in. The Giant Cyber King was horrific. Biggest plot holes out of the revived series. All of the other side characters, like the companion to David Morrissey's Doctor, has absolutely nothing to her at all. Lazily written, full of exposition, full of plot holes, boring. I think it's one of the worst episodes of the whole show. That's my review. It's bad.
Tell us what you really think, Jesus.
I get the feeling Rosita is only here because if not, then they know that people would look at the episode and go, they hate women.
Oh, right, because of the villain.
Yes. I get the feeling that's the only reason she's here.
Having a minority bit character that's literally supposed to be a stand-in for an existing one.
He's a minority character who's a token.
Yeah, token of another white character. Like, it's so much worse the longer you think about it.
Why does this episode have really horrible implications?
This is what happens when you don't think about stuff very much in the early 2000s.
I always like people act like the Russell T Davies era is so unproblematical too. I'm like,
It's more that people see the rose-tinted glasses. I'm clearly revealing myself to be a massive Cyber fan. They're probably my favorite monster on the show, even though they're never really used that well. So I'm always suffering whenever they show up.
Same.
Both times the Russell T Davies has thrown the Cybermen has basically nerfed them to make the Daleks look cool, and it annoys me every single time. The Cybermen were completely bottled to make the Daleks look cooler.
As much as the Cybermen are really lame in Doomsday, at least in that episode, he wrote some very good dialogue for them. So it does show that he sort of gets the concept behind him. But I think he was too focused on the whole Dalek-Cybermen war, but he also wanted the Daleks to survive. So it was a bit of a mess. The Cybermen just looked like absolute jokes. I think they ended up even forming an alliance with the humans to fight the Daleks because they've been beaten that badly.
That's not an utter betrayal of their entire premise. Then again, it's not like the Daleks have been perfectly written every single time.
Davis also is responsible for the delete catchphrase, which is the worst catchphrase any monster in the show's history. Literally just trying to turn them into the Daleks.
I think the Daleks going to be handled badly, but I think Davis seemed to have a lot more respect for them than the Cybermen.
This is a testament to how unmemorable this episode is. Brianna and I, watching this episode a couple of days ago, have talked about the delete thing, and she doesn't remember it. Part of the issue with, just they might as well be robots and not Cybermen, is that they keep killing people.
They just walk around and like murder people.
Their entire thing became that they assimilate people, yeah.
I just got struck with inspiration of like how you obviously take like the broad strokes of this episode and make it a thing that like deserves to be a Cyberman episode. Because like we've been talking about how like when the Cybermen do work, it's taking advantage of that human element. In World Enough in Time, it's like the horror of like watching the slow transition of how we got there. Yeah. Of like Cybermen started out as something you could see is just like regular prosthetics for people who got really badly injured, and then it just slowly morphs into this horrifying thing in series 12. Even though Brianna also doesn't like a half-faced Frankenstein Cyberman guy, he's interesting at least because it's like he's stuck halfway like through his conversion, and it drives him insane because he just wants to be a full Cyberman. He's far enough in the process that his human half just like makes him disgusted with himself. You can make a really good version of this episode where Jackson Lake gets like his entire identity overwritten by this information about the Doctor. That in and of itself is kind of horrifying. The real thing that makes the Cybermen terrifying isn't just that your body is gone, it's that the person that you were is gone. And that's what happened to this guy. It's just he didn't get turned into a Cyberman, he got turned into the Doctor. And so if we made this like intentional parallel where, oh man, the Doctor's like personality is like so big, or just like this piece of technology with the info stamps, it created this really unfortunate like tragedy. This wasn't anyone's plan. It was just a really like sad, unfortunate accident. This guy might as well have been converted into a Cyberman anyway. The Doctor is a good person, but is it really any better than becoming a Cyberman because of the person that he was is still just gone?
This is why I was bothered why they didn't touch on this in Journey's End, because essentially the same thing that happens to the governor here, I'm going to keep calling him that, sorry, happens to Donna, and it's like never treated as this horrible thing. The only bad thing about it is that they have to like unwrite all of her memories of the Doctor, but the actual like thing that happens to her is half of her brain basically gets overwritten by the Doctor, and she ceases to become herself.
Yeah, I can't believe we've done this premise twice and not like capitalized on it, especially in a Cyberman episode.
The Doctor doesn't really bring that up at all, even though he's still bummed out by Donna's memory wipe.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with that. The thing for me about Cyberman stories is that, like, as you guys were kind of saying before, like the whole thing with a good Cyberman story is that it's got to lean into the whole transhumanism element where they like what defines humanity, and cybernetics are kind of like overriding that. Part of the reason why one of my favorites is actually Nightmare in Silver, because of Dr. Clever and that whole like literally incarnating the idea of the conversion into like another separate personality. It's what this episode could have been if they had leaned more into the transhumanism and overriding a personalities element, like that one aspect.
Yeah, there's some makings here for a good episode, but it's just so lazily written and just full of
wasted
just
potential.
I think Nightmare in Silver has the same issue that a lot of Series 7 episodes have, is that they have a lot of ideas that would have worked better for a two-parter, and that affects the entire series. It will get to there.
We want a series of movies.
The one thing I will say about the idea of the Doctor imprinting on a human being, it would be a really nice inversion of the Family of Blood and Human Nature, where the Doctor becomes a human and we explore the idea of how great the Doctor is and how detached he is from humanity, and we see that fully formed by a human who becomes the Doctor and loses that part of his humanity. And again, that would have been a nice kind of callback. They referenced that two-parter in the episode. It's like Russell T Davies just wrote down and didn't want to capitalize on anything he was writing because he didn't care.
And the whole like getting his identity overwritten in the first place, which is another one of those, there's something that's almost here. I think it's an accident.
You accidentally created depth.
Because it's just, my thing is, when we like have our first sort of like novelty first act of the episode where it's like, is this the Doctor or isn't it?
No.
He doesn't even act like
the answer is no.
Like, that's another thing of like drop the facade very quickly, because none of David Morrissey's dialogue is very doctory. None of his mannerisms are very doctory. Again, like I joked earlier, but genuinely, the fact that he goes in for a hug at like a job well done, like the Doctor's companion does as the Doctor commands or whatever. Like, he really doesn't have any dialogue or mannerisms that are actually like any doctor.
Is anyone else really bothered by that line, by the way?
Yeah,
the companion does as the doctor commands. Like,
I think John Pertwee's doctor was very like that. He was very like, commanding and authoritative.
He could be commanding, but he would never say that line.
I am your god, and you will do as I say.
The doctor could be like that if he wanted. Somehow even more egotistical than he is.
But this is like where part of the accidental depth comes in, where it's like he doesn't act like the doctor at all. He acts like someone who got imprinted with like a synopsis of who the doctor is. And that maybe makes sense because these Cybermen have only ever interacted with 10, and all of their information about Doctors 1 through 9 is, you presume, secondhand. When he gets like downloaded with an info stamp of the Doctor, he literally just is getting a synopsis. Like, this is who the Cybermen think the Doctor is, and that is who this person is acting like. Not the Doctor's actual personality, but like a second, third-hand account of who he is as a general like figure to his enemies. And I think that's like an accident. It's an interesting idea.
He's a 10th Doctor stand-in fanfic created by the Cybermen.
Oh dear lord. Let's not go down that path any longer.
One of the weirder traditions of the Christmas specials is that they're trying to be whimsical and cute and fun. This is more Russell T Davies, but they're all incredibly dark and depressing and dreary and serious.
The biggest one is The Runaway Bride, where it just ends with the Doctor murdering children.
What I really give Moffat is that even though he can put dark subject matter, especially Christmas Carol, into his Christmas specials, they're a lot more whimsical and fun. Mostly Davis' stories are surprisingly bleak, which again is weird because he's a much sillier writer than Moffat is, and he's somebody who doesn't take himself as seriously. But when it comes to the Christmas special, Moffat has him in terms of just being fun, regardless of the quality of those episodes, because most Christmas specials are kind of meh. I think of a Christmas Carol where the Doctor's riding around in sleighing with swimming sharks, and that's such a cool image, and it's so fun and whimsical, and it's my favorite Christmas special. At least in the end of time, you can justify it because it's 10th generation story, but for the rest of them, it's just kind of the odd continuation of Russell T Davies getting everyone together for a nice Christmas dinner and making them depressed while living hell.
Is it weird for anyone else that his son has no dialogue?
He's basically a dog.
He's literally like a lamp. He's just a plot device. I genuinely wonder, like, a plot device for what, though?
Tried to do several things and just accomplish none of them because, like, not enough effort was put in. Like, I'm sure there is a reason that he exists.
I think the one reason he exists is so that when we end this episode, it's not a complete bust for Jackson Lake, because he's already lost his wife. He's like had his identity and his fake identity shattered. His son is like a little thing of like, okay, he has something.
This is your participation trophy, your son that doesn't talk.
Because it's Doctor Who, and like you can't really be that sad.
Yeah.
You have suffered, have a child.
He's like a potted plant. He's like, here's your reward, the plant.
You can't really end a Doctor Who episode that sadly. Dark water has entered the chat.
With the exception of giving him a happy ending, there's no reason for that kid to be in this episode. Like, there's a whole bunch of other kids. Everyone else got out so fast, and then like 5 minutes later, he walks up.
I've been paralyzed by plot contrivance.
The episode's so badly written, I can't move. Well acted, badly written episode.
I thought you were going to defend it, Brian.
I don't know why, but I'm dying on this hill.
Brian, you were like, I have a hot take when we were in the group chat, and then you're just like bad-mouthing it like the rest of us at this point.
Yeah, I think we've kind of exhausted literally anything we can talk about. And most of it's just me fanboying over the Cybermen. This episode is really horribly written. There's no effort put into any idea they have. It's not that well directed. It's actually the final episode before they converted to HD. That was the only significant thing about it. They started filming everything in HD after this.
I'm learning so much weird about this episode.
We're going from a really, really boring episode to a really, really boring, insane episode that they shot in Dubai.
I like the acting. Please don't kill me.
It's lame.
Yeah,
David
bad,
Morris,
lazy, boring, stupid, stitched together. Terrible.
David Morrissey is trying, but Russell T Davies really isn't.
You sure you got it all out, Rob?
I have nothing more to say besides some bullet points.
Conclusion, I will see you all at the Easter special, because we know it's the Easter special because the Doctor eats an Easter egg at the beginning, and that's literally all the references to Easter we get.